Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it's really fabulous to see you here tonight. In the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and thank them for their custodianship of this land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd like to acknowledge in our audience tonight Casper Kuiper, Honorary Consul, Consulate of the Netherlands here in Brisbane, and also, before we begin, just acknowledge a couple of apologies, one from Professor Ian O'Connor, Vice-Chancellor and President of Griffith University, and also from Chris Sains, Director here of QAGOMA. As always, Griffith Asia Institute is really delighted to be able to bring you one of these Perspectives Asia events in partnership, of course, with the Australian Centre for Asia Pacific Art, Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. As you know, many of you are regulars, this is a partnership that we truly treasure. It's really about generating discussion about Australia's engagement in the Asia Pacific, to provide insights into the development of new conversations, new practices, different perspectives for dealing with the changing environment within which we live. So we welcome you to our second seminar for this year, 2018. It's the second seminar in our 14th year of Perspectives Asia, and we're really looking forward to keeping on going for another great year. Before I actually start talking about tonight's event, let me quickly put a date claimer out there for you. Our next event will be held on the 17th of May. Our speaker on that evening is Cameron G. Teese. He is a professor and director of the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University, and he will be talking to us on that occasion about China's engagement with global governance from an American perspective. Should be a great conversation, so I hope you're able to make it. I'd also quickly like to acknowledge Yering Station, one of the sponsors for tonight's event. So let's talk about tonight's conversation. We are truly delighted to be collaborating with Griffith Review and to join them in celebrating the 59th edition of Griffith Review, titled Commonwealth Now. It's really timely for us to be thinking about the Commonwealth at this particular point in time. We're midway through the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast. Well, actually, I say on the Gold Coast, but there are also activities in Brisbane, Townsville and Cairns. We're about to head into, as an institution, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London. That'll be taking place in the next couple of weeks. So it's really timely for us to really think about what the Commonwealth means for us, what it is as an institution, and to think about its relevance and its role today. The Commonwealth has evolved to become one of the oldest international organisations in today's global landscape. As an association of independent states, it was, of course, founded by the British Empire, incorporating former colonies and dominions, peoples and communities from every continent across the globe. As an institution, it's weathered tectonic shifts, great conflicts, enduring power struggles. And in the post-war environment, during her Christmas address of 1953, Queen Elizabeth II articulated what she saw at that time to be the fresh mission of the Commonwealth as an entirely new conception, built on the highest qualities of the spirit of man, friendship, loyalty, and the desire for freedom and peace. And so it has evolved, and it continues to evolve, to become today what and I was at a conference last week on the Gold Coast where the Secretary-General for the Commonwealth Secretariat talked about the family of nations, 53 member countries, 71 nations that contribute to an enormous diversity and dynamism of that Commonwealth, and of course an unflinching enthusiasm for sport. But today, in 2018, there's another story that we need to think about. And again, it comes back to the idea of the role and relevance of the Commonwealth in an era of dramatic change in the global landscape. Change that reflects the swinging pendulum of power moving from west to east. And I guess we're here tonight to tease out some of these issues, to talk about how we see the Commonwealth. Is it an anachronism today, emblematic of an empire past, or does it have contemporary relevance in our increasingly complex and ever contested environment? So these are some of the issues I think we'll be teasing out through a conversation that is going to be moderated by Jane Camens. Jane is the co-editor of Griffith Review 49. Some of you will have seen it entitled New Asia Now, as well as the Griffith Review 59, Commonwealth Now. And I should note, we have copies available for sale outside. They were available for sale before. They'll still be available when we finish tonight, so please make your way and check that edition out. Jane is the Executive Director of Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, an association that she founded in 2005, while she was also studying at Griffith University. So she's an alumni of ours as well, an alumna of ours. She has organised annual writers' conferences in cities around Asia and has an enormous amount of expertise in thinking differently and creatively about some of the key topics of relevance to our time today. I'm going to hand over now to Jane, and Jane will introduce our two panellists, both contributing authors to the current edition of the Commonwealth Now, Sali Tripathi and Annie Zaidi. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. That's really wonderful. Thank you. So it is my pleasure to introduce Salil and Annie to you this evening. But first of all, just a few words about the issue, Commonwealth Now. There are so many voices in this issue from around the world, the old British Empire, and it did make us wonder what we had in common. We have some things in common, like laws, which we'll talk about later, literature that we often share from the British monopolies that tended to dominate our publishing world. But we also have many, many different stories. We have a lot of stories of loss, we have stories that haven't been told because they're not allowed to be told. One of our authors, Jenny Hockey, talks about the dismissal and the fact that the Queen still has not released certain documents that were relevant and pertinent to the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. Again, before I introduce you, I just want to thank the Griffith Asia Institute, because the Griffith Asia Institute was actually the original home of Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, which I started. So thank you to the Griffith Asia Institute. And on that note, I'm going to introduce you to my good friend and former colleague, Salil Tripathi, who is a contributing editor for several publications in India, Mint and Caravan. He's also a journalist whose work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal and, of course, in the great Far Eastern Economic Review, where he and I were colleagues 1,000 years ago. Also the International Herald Tribune and the New York Times he's worked for. In 2015, he's a recipient of the Red Ink Award from the Mumbai Press Club for his human rights journalism. And he's also, which isn't listed in his bio, he's also chair of PEN's Writers in Prison Committee, which is an important international group of that fights for writers who are imprisoned. And I should say that Salil is also working on an exhibition with one of the artists who is going to be exhibited in the Triennial at the. So that's to do with the writers in prison, poets in prison. So yes, on my left, Annie Zaidi is a writer, filmmaker, and poet from India. Her collection of essays, Known Turf, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales, was shortlisted for the Vodafone Crossword Book Award in 2010. She has written for Griffith Review 49, New Asia Now, and also for Griffith Review 53, Our Sporting Life, which we actually haven't discussed and is very relevant for the Commonwealth Games. So
we shall discuss it now.
We shall discuss it now. I think that's a really good thing to do. First of all, I'd like you both, and I'll ask Salil first and then I'll ask Zaidi, to talk a little bit about your contribution to the Commonwealth Now edition of Griffith Review. You have a particularly beautiful story about your son, but you might want to expand a little further about your contribution. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you everyone, first of all. When Jane said that she wanted me to write on Commonwealth, I thought it was very pertinent topic and an interesting topic for me to write, because I grew up in one Commonwealth country, which was India. Then I lived for 8 years in another Commonwealth country, which was Singapore, as a journalist, and saw the handover of Hong Kong in 1997 for a magazine, which was also an important event. And now I live in England for the last 18 years, which is where it all began, and so on. So I thought I would try to weave the three together. And in particular, what I was interested in looking at was the peculiar thinking going on in Britain now, which is who are we? Particularly in the light of the vote a year and a half ago on Brexit, wanting to leave Europe, and this almost, I should say, naive assumption that they've discarded one partner and they can walk into the home of their old flame, as it were, and say bye-bye to the woman they are divorcing, which is European Union, and go back to the woman they wanted to marry or to whom they were married once, which was the Commonwealth, without realizing that the world has moved on, and without realizing that it has changed, that everybody else also realizes that Europe is a much bigger market. Everybody else also realizes that China is the name of the game. Everybody also realizes that India is a large market, and so is the US. So yes, it would be important for people to have good relations with a country of 60 to 70 million people, but Europe with 500 odd million people is a far bigger market. And I started looking at some of the examples and stories, and there are countries within the Commonwealth which have now overshot Britain in terms of per capita income. Classic example being my former home, Singapore. Of course, it's slightly distorted because it has 5.5 million people and not 55 or 60 million people, but it has shown that sort of progress. Canada is interested in preserving NAFTA. Other countries want to have better ties with China or with Europe. And India would love to have a free trade agreement with Britain, but only if in return there could be unhindered access for Indians to go and work and live and study in Britain. And the whole point of leaving was to keep the foreigners out in Britain at one level. So it's a very, very peculiar thinking that was going on. So I tried to unpack and understand that kind of a thinking, and which was very England-centric, and I use that word advisedly because I think the Scots and the Irish particularly do look at this issue very differently. And seeing that history from only a particular angle as a kind of a top-down history which was taught in Britain. And that's where the story comes in. I moved from Singapore to Britain in 1999. And when I was leaving, I was used to a very efficient country where opening a bank account took 3.5 minutes and getting electricity moved in, supplied into your house took about 7.5 minutes, something like that in Singapore. In Britain, I had to produce all kinds of documentations and so on, very similar to what I was used to in India earlier. This is not a complaint. I mean, I'm happy to, I like test matches. I like things that go on for a long period. So that's not a problem here. So yeah, I was doing that. But then in the first week that we were in London, or the second week, the school where my children were going, and they were 6 and 9 at that time, for my younger son, they said that this is our British History Week. And therefore, everyone has to come, every child has to come dressed as a character important in British history. So I said, all right, we shall do that. Now, where was I going to find a military uniform for a child so that he looks like Montgomery? or to try to get something that might make him look like a character from Shakespeare. So I thought, none of that is going to work. If he goes wearing a suit like a character from P.G. Wodehouse, that also wouldn't work. So I said, all right, I gave him something similar to what I was wearing, put a red rose here, and I said, say that you're dressed up as Jawaharlal Nehru. And he went there, school, poor chap, 6, 7 years old. And the teacher said, okay. I was called the next day. I said, it is British, the History Week, not World History Week. I said, yes, I think Nehru was kind of important for British history. And she said, why do you say that? I said, well, studied at Harrow and Cambridge. Yes, so? I said, yeah, 9 years in British jails, donated his entire wealth to fight the British, and then he parted as a friend, and he became part of the Commonwealth. And he made sure that the Indian system that emerged out of that in 1947 was run as a parliamentary democracy with the highest traditions of maize parliamentary practices and so on. And she said, maybe, but I don't think so. So I said, all right, so my hope is that, towards, at some point in future, she will read better history, and she will get to know that British history is not only about Churchill, but also about Kwame Nkrumah, also about Jomo Kenyatta, also about Tunku Abdul Rahman, also about Nelson Mandela, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Gandhi.
Yeah, one of the things we found from co-editing this issue is that a constant theme, people saying that the British don't know this history that they left behind. They don't know and they won't acknowledge it. So whereas there are museums in different countries to histories that really they probably don't want to acknowledge. Not so much in Britain. There's not that history of acknowledging what happened in countries around the Commonwealth, which might be my new thing to fight for. Annie, let's talk about your contribution to Commonwealth Now and what you wrote about. Let's give the audience a sense, those few who might not buy the volume.
Everybody will buy the volume.
Of course they will.
Right. So one of the things that when I was asked for a submission, initially I thought I'd try out fiction, but one of the things that had been preoccupying me for a long time was the idea of politicization, especially the politicization of young minds. That's something I'd been thinking about for a while, and I continue to think about it in various ways, but with specific relevance to the Commonwealth. India did have an education system of sorts before the British came in, but the modern university, the way it is recognized and the way it is structured, and the power dynamics between the state and the university and students was something that sort of was established during British rule, and that hasn't changed much, I think, in over 150 years. So what's happening in India now is that students are often not quite allowed to have their say, are often sometimes just, they're prevented from, say, having a demonstration or prevented from holding a seminar. But over the last couple of years, things had really hotted up. One of the top-ranked universities in the country, the president of the Students' Union was arrested. 2 other students had to go underground. There were warrants out. And the law invoked was sedition, which is an 1870 law that the British brought in. And the thing with the sedition law is that it was often used and misused by the British to suppress dissent. Sedition was one of the laws. The other law that was often used, especially during the Quit India movement, was Defense of India. My grandfather was arrested under the Defense of India rules when he was a student. In 1941, he went to jail. So I started to actually think about the student movement in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and what is happening now, and how that was different from this. And I felt as if there's a lot that hasn't actually changed. The same laws are being used for one, sedition being used against students for just saying things like, what happened in India recently was that the student hadn't even said what he was accused of having said. It was doctored video footage, which the court later kind of found and set him free, but that wasn't the point. The point was that the police was sent in just because students were shouting things. And you could arrest someone, and under sedition laws, you could be imprisoned for life. And then what is our relationship to the state? Is it the same relationship that India had with the British state? If the state is going to treat us, especially young people and students, in the same way that the British government used to treat its colonial subjects, then what is this relationship? That is the thing that I was thinking about. And the essay that I write sort of is part memoir, so it starts from my grandfather's history. His arrest in 1941. He was put away for 6 months. Not very much that was terrible happened to him, because at that time a lot of the tallest leaders of the freedom movement went to jail. Mahatma Gandhi was jailed for sedition. So this was sort of par for the course. Almost every young student leader was in jail at that time. They went to jail, they read books, they were political prisoners. They often came out better educated because they learned another language in jail or something like that. My grandfather learned another script when he was in jail. His engagement was broken off, though, because the girl's side didn't think it was such a good thing going to jail. But yes, and I never really questioned any of this or talked to him or examined any of his ideas growing up. When I was growing up, to be apolitical was to be seen as the better thing to be. Even now in India, it's very common to meet people and they'll just say, oh, I'm apolitical. As if that was a fine thing. And it has taken, so my piece is really a memoir of me slowly turning political and learning to embrace politicization as not just a positive, but an imperative. A democracy cannot function without people being political. So that's what the essay is about. And I went from not knowing any politics at all, not being encouraged to think about, not only not think about politics, but not to do anything that is remotely political. To very slowly, as a journalist, learning to engage with political ideas, to finally joining protests and movements and things like that.
Thanks, Sali. Now, Salil, you've got a poem that you've written about Brexit. And I'm wondering whether you would like to share that with us.
Sure. Very happy to. Australia is one country which loves when the British nose is rubbed. So it's a good place to do that. This is palm bashing on my part, yeah. It's called On Leaving Europe. Our love was never love, really. It was an alliance, a pact. Ties were forged for steel and coal, the bonhomie, a mere act. They spoke in foreign tongues over there, with umlauts and funny accents. They always drove on the wrong side, at school, their grammar a torment. The channel was our moat, actually, to keep away the dragons. The tunnel snake beneath the water, we hid behind our wagons. We like our beer warm, in pints, theirs chilled and served in liters. Our meadows stretch for miles and miles, theirs circumscribed in meters. Our isles were cold and wet and grey, on theirs the sun would shine. Our beaches small and filled with stones, theirs dry like ancient wine. Romans came and built our roads, Normans came to rule, Germans gave us kings and queens, we weren't anyone's tools. To write our stories, our Bard of Avon went to Verona and Venice. Byron's muse was an alpine rock. Lady Brett Ashley at Paris. We split our blood everywhere, in Flanders, Ypres, Tyne Court. White, but also brown and black, a past we often forgot. We can hold our head high now, tell Brussels who's the boss. We build our walls and cut our ties, unaware of our loss. We want our past to make us big, the map reassuringly pink. The past is now a foreign land. We shrivel and we shrink. But our home is our castle again, even if it crumbles. We will keep calm and carry on, and we mustn't grumble. And so we leave proud and bitter, our upper lip still stiff, to seek a past we think was great, secure on those white cliffs. Disentangling the ties that bind is not simple, nor is easy. Now they are here and we are there. The untying makes us dizzy. We lose our parts, become smaller. There go the Irish, the Scots. We are back in time, 1973, lost in our own little plot. Our empire lives in our minds. We thought it would be easy to turn the clock back to then, when tomorrow was rosy. We thought that we would always matter. Our days would never end. But they did, and we will find we are a small island.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, as we mentioned before, QAGOMA is about to happen, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and I thought it might be interesting to get a sense from both of you about what you think QAGOMA might or might not achieve. I mean, in sense of, you know, where is the Commonwealth going to be? Modi's going to be there. I assume that Malcolm Turnbull will be there. Let's start with you, Annie. Do you have any thoughts about QAGOMA and Modi's presence there?
I think that summits of this sort, whether it's QAGOMA or whether it's any other kind of international summit where leaders meet, it's very hard to say what they will accomplish. I know that what India is looking for is investment, and investment of the type that will generate employment, because the current government is in a real soup on the employment front. They have overpromised and overcommitted to the people by any stretch of any imagination. It would have been very hard, even if they'd been trying, but the measures that the government has taken has actually led to a fall in employment instead of a rise in employment. And I do not think that local investment is cutting it. So if the Prime Minister intends to achieve his stated goals, then that's where my sense is that's what he'd be trying for.
Okay. Salil, do you have any sense of QAGOMA, what it might achieve for India or for any of the other Commonwealth countries that...
I think what Britain would want is some, for domestic political reasons, some sort of an assurance that the post-Brexit future would be bright. And it would want to show that, you know, we'll have great deals with Canada and that we'll have wonderful deals with Australia and so on. And it really depends on what's in it for Canada and Australia, for example. I mentioned those two countries because those are two large economies. So is India, but India, I did touch upon it, that India would want better access for either for IT, the software companies to send more people there, or the doctors and nurses to go there, and students to stay on and work after their graduation there. And that's one reason Indian students are going less and less to Britain, but to other countries, because after they find it very hard to get work permits there. So that's one of the things that's going to happen from the other countries in the periphery. So I think Britain expects that when March 2019 comes and Brexit, assuming it becomes a reality, I'm still not sure. Nobody knows. I think even Theresa May doesn't know what's going to happen in March 2019. But assuming that Boris Johnson gets his way and David Davis gets his way, and they do have a Brexit, they would want to show some deals. And what seems to be happening is they're not getting them.
Yeah, I mean...
And I think that's why they're going to do that, and therefore they will give some sops. Now, those could be in terms of investment, better aid and assistance. So there will have to be some financial commitments on the part of Britain. And that kind of a transaction is likely to occur, yes.
So QAGOMA is like... please save us.
In a way, it is they want to create, because they are not going. If you're Singapore, you have ASEAN, you have APEC.
Yeah.
If you are Australia, you have, Trans-Pacific Partnership of some form that's going to take place at that time. If you're China, you have the world, and you're even at WTO, you can command. So Britain actually is going to be so isolated, not being part of any of the trading regimes, and say, yes, you can trade under WTO rules. And now Norway announced just yesterday that it will extend the current privileges to Britain. So it will all be uncertain, and one of the biggest impacts of that uncertainty is going to be that one of the biggest powerhouses of British economy is the finance sector. And the banks will say, okay, we are going to Frankfurt. I think that's a big worry.
Yeah. Now, in our far-reaching discussion about how this conversation would go, one of the things that Annie spoke about was the new colonialism. Do you remember we were talking about the selling of arms, of foodstuffs? Talk to me about some specific examples, like personal examples, if you like, about what you consider the new colonialism.
My understanding of colonialism is when a country comes to another country and tries not to trade with it, but to in some way enslave it. And like in India, for example, whenever we talk about the colonial experience, we describe it as an enslavement. The word used is ghulami. Even though we do not have the same experience of, say, the slave trade or anything like it, but it was very clear to India that we were once in some way free because we traded on free and equal terms, or terms that suited us, and that was prevented. Basically what the British did was, this was one of the big things they achieved. The East India Company first, and then the government itself. Through trade, they basically prevented not only the free movement of trade, but prevented Indians from choosing their own trade. So for instance, what the whole Gandhi March and for salt is that what they did in India was that people couldn't make their own salt. We would have to buy salt through the British, and it was salt of our own making on our own land. The fear of the new colonialism is the kind of trade that will once again prevent us from trading on terms that are good and equal for us. And so for instance, certainly with defense and arms, a lot of this happened then through corruption and is happening now through corruption too. We didn't call it corruption then, but corruption was what it was. The East India Company would come and bribe, say, a certain kingdom, bribe the prime minister of a certain king, and that king would betray the people, so to speak, in that sense, or use one king against the other. What's happening now, for instance, with the Rafale deal, the terms are completely against our country. The last government had negotiated better terms. This government has negotiated worse terms. And why that has happened is very complicated, because now an Indian businessman is also involved. But a lot of what's happening is that the Indian taxpayer is paying for trade deals which benefit other countries.
Okay.
And similarly, for instance, with black money and corruption, the whole problem is that what often happens is that money just leaves the country. And we have no way. A lot of these are actually former British colonies or other places where money is parked, places like the Cayman Islands and things like that. The money is leaving the country, and it's taxpayer money. It's public money which goes out through banks, through various other sources. And if the people do not have control over what their own wealth is, we say we are a democracy and a free country. If we have no control over where our wealth goes, and if it's not coming back to us as benefits in some fashion, then we are on the path to a new kind of colonialism.
I think that's a really important big story. But bringing it closer to home, into your personal experience, you spoke to me about the multiplexes, could you just talk about that, how the new multiplexes, the big cinemas in India have changed the way, and who gets to view what, and what you think that that's doing about social division? Yeah.
So one of the things that has happened post-liberalization in India, the opening up of the economy, which initially was very kind of lauded and applauded, the income gap has grown very sharp. Wealth has got more and more concentrated. And one of the things that I noticed was about 10, 15 years ago, until about 10, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years, most Indians watched cinemas in massive theatres, massive meaning 1,000-seaters. And the poor people would be sitting right in the front at the stalls, and the middle class would be sitting in the balcony, which was also quite big. I mean, the balcony alone would be 5 times the size of this theatre. And then there would be the boxes, which would be... But all of these were... None of this was super expensive, but certainly everybody watched the same thing. And so filmmakers and artists, whatever they created was seen by everybody. The terms were dictated as much by the tastes of the poor as they were by the middle class and the rich. So there was a little bit of it. This often led to the creation of what we call the Bollywood masala film, the formula film, which has everything in it, a little romance, a little bit of fighting, a little bit of something, a little bit of rich, a little bit of poor, good middle class values that everyone can aspire to, all of that. Last 10 years, 15 years, we now have, most of the old cinemas have gone. What we now have are multiplexes. The size of the theatres range from maybe the size of this to maybe twice the size of this size. The ticket prices have gone up exorbitantly, ranging from anywhere from 200 rupees to even 1,000 rupees per ticket. 40% to 50% of, or even 60% of the money that the cinemas make are through food and beverage. So when we go into theatres, we are made to go through a security check, and it's not looking for weapons, they're looking for food. I cannot walk into a cinema with a bar of chocolate. The whole thing is that you have to buy from us. So then where does that leave the lower middle class or even the middle class in terms of their relationship with art, with cinema, with popular culture? On what terms do they go to the cinema? And who then decides what kind of cinema is being made? More and more our cinema, especially our popular cinema, is not really about the lives of the poor at all. At all. If they are, they're sort of arty, and those films almost always fail. A lot of the cinema is about people traveling abroad and having rich people's problems, and caste is never mentioned. Earlier, religious amity was mentioned. That is no longer mentioned. So the ways in which we see ourselves, popular culture determines how we see ourselves. That has changed through money.
Yeah. So I want to bring this back. Thank you, Annie. I wanted you to talk about that. Salil, before I open this up to questions, which I need to do in a minute, you really wanted to talk about fake news and this Indian term meaning insisting on the truth. And I think that's important here when we're talking about perceptions of who sees what and what they see. And you're very keen to do this not only in just relation to India, but in relation to other Commonwealth countries. Do you want to talk a little bit about Malaysia, Singapore, and so forth? Fake news, which is one of your particular things.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic, and I'm going to talk about it a couple of days later in Sydney as well on that theme. I think because of the almost fictional nature of Trump presidency on one hand, it looks like a wonderful plot of a badly written novel, but the way it's going on in America. But that said, this desire on the part, and I mean, what's interesting, the Orwellian part of it is this, that the state is criticizing the people, that fake news is being spread, some of you are responsible for it, and we are going to control it. But if you really look at it, most of the fake news, and I don't like calling it fake news because we are talking about lies here. And most of the lies are actually perpetrated by the state. And it's interesting, 3 completely unrelated incidents have happened in the last 10 days or so in this region, in Asia Pacific. And I was just talking about it with Jane, and I thought there is no pattern here, but obviously it shows the desire of the state to look at truth in a particular way. And those are interesting. One is that in India, there was a proposal barely a week ago by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting that if you want to be accredited as a journalist, which allows you to enter government buildings to do your interviews, and if you have that accredited card, and if there's a well-founded complaint of fake news against you, then it will be suspended for 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, the Press Council, which is ostensibly an autonomous body, will then take a decision and action against you. Huge uproar, and the Prime Minister said that this is wrong, and the proposal was withdrawn, but it's not gone away. I think it'll come back. If you look at Malaysia, one of the biggest issues that has been gripping Malaysian politics, and Malaysia goes to elections, I think, in a few weeks, is the scandal about 1MDB, this company, which is the state-owned finance-oriented company. And nobody can explain why, and even the recipient cannot explain why, is that $700 million, and I'll repeat it, $700 million were deposited in the personal account of the Prime Minister. And he can't explain how they came there, how the money came there, nor can he say who deposited it. And if you report or write about it, which Wall Street Journal and Financial Times did it initially, there was a move against it. And they said that this is fake news, that these are lies. And where they've come to, and now there's a federal prosecution against a particular Malaysian set of individuals. Singapore is probing into that matter too. But the response that the Malaysian government has is to pass a law that if you end up spreading fake news, you are going to be responsible for, you are going to be jailed for a long period. And in Singapore, it is slightly more sophisticated, but it's a question about the history, what happened in 1963 and 1987. And those of you who know Singapore history, 1963 was Operation Cold Store, and 1987 was the Operation Spectrum, which is when dissidents who were left-leaning were arrested without trial, and some were kept in jail for 20, 25 years, and so on. And there is a Singaporean academic called Peng Jin Tung who runs a website called New Narrative. He actually challenged some of these ideas. And he said, when you're talking about fake news, it's not the people who are doing it, it's the state which is producing a narrative, which is actually creating an impression in the minds of the people that this is the truth when it may not be so. So if you want to regulate state news, fake news, you also have to see what the state is doing as part of its own propaganda machinery. And what I find, and there was a big 6-hour long, and it's on YouTube if those of you who are fascinated by Singapore politics, and I am, so I did watch all the 6 hours, but it's probably worth looking at it because it's an extremely civil debate, but it's also a very chilling and intimidating exercise because the idea was to interrogate and intimidate the academic in this case, who held his own, but we don't know for how long, I mean, as these things tend to be in Singapore. And I think what seems to be happening is who is in charge of the narrative is increasingly coming into question because of the ease of broadcasting on the internet. More and more people are putting out information in a sophisticated way. And this applies also to history. And if people are going to challenge history in Singapore or in India, there's a huge battle going on over history. And in Britain, where Boris Johnson can come around and say, we were all great friends once, we traded with each other, now let's do it again. But if you look at the kind of trade and the terms of trade that the Commonwealth was built on, it was not Britannia rules the waves, but Britannia waves the rules. Basically, Britain was coming and setting its version of free trade on people. And it was free to buy and sell what it wanted at prices it wanted. But anything that was competing with British prices or British system, those industry was killed. So it was beggars our neighbor policy, and that was the model of trade that Britain had excelled in. So if that's the world Britain wants to recreate in the post-Brexit era, then it's going to be in for a very hard reckoning.
I need to open the audience, invite you all to ask questions. I'm sure that either Annie or Salil would be delighted to answer your questions. So please, if you have any questions, please put them to us. Anyone want to ask any questions? Yes. Is there a mic?
I'd like to ask, perhaps I need a refresher. When I think of the Commonwealth Now, how many countries are in the Commonwealth now, and how do they communicate?
53?
Yeah.
53?
Yeah.
And how do they communicate? There's a Commonwealth Secretariat, which is very nice to be on if you're if you're a public servant in the government. You get to travel to different Commonwealth meetings, but as much as what it achieves, it's not a lot, from my understanding, talking to public servants who have been on these meetings.
I don't know if Commonwealth countries do communicate with each other as Commonwealth countries. I mean, like if India and Nigeria talk, I don't know if we communicate as India and Nigeria who are members of the Commonwealth. We just talk as India and Nigeria.
I think what probably does happen, and I'm speculating, is that because the source of law is similar, it probably is easier to write agreements between the countries. Because I think most people in Commonwealth would know what certain sections of the law mean. Section 144 of the Penal Code, particularly on the criminal side. So I think there's a lot of understanding of each other in terms of the jurisprudence that they're relying on, because they're all common law countries. But other than that, you're right, absolutely. It's taken as India and Nigeria, which is, I think they're more likely to talk about both being non-aligned, which itself is a different relic, as it were.
Yes, and how often do Australians talk to Jamaica and various other countries? We don't have a lot in common, really. Were there any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, so thank you very much for that discussion. That was very interesting. My name is Rashmi. I'm from Papua New Guinea, so of course Commonwealth Now is imperative reading for me. So my question is directed at you, Annie. So I'm a writer from Papua New Guinea, and last year we produced the first anthology out of the country, written all by Papua New Guinean women writers. And you were a contributor to an anthology, Walking Towards Ourselves, Indian Women Tell Their Stories, and that book really inspired our book. So yeah, I read your contribution in that, and I was just, when I saw your name on the WOW Festival program, so I've been stalking you since WOW. This is the third time I've heard you speak. So my question is, and it has to do with donor funding and its impact on literature in India. So for all of you who don't know, Papua New Guinea is a former territory. Papua New Guinea is a former territory of Australia, and it's not really acknowledged, unfortunately. I was educated here in Australia, so I've lived between both countries most of my life, and I didn't learn anything about PNG history when I went to school here, all throughout primary up to university, really, other than the Kokoda campaign. So that's quite sad for us. Given the impact of the presence, the huge presence Australia has even now since independence. So my question, Annie, is our book, so it's called My Walk to Equality, and it's predominantly feminist writers in the book, and domestic violence, it's an epidemic in PNG. And so we had a lot of writers writing around that issue, but the focus of the book was about the positive contributions PNG women are making in the country, especially towards national development, something that the Australian media overlooks when it reports about Papua New Guinea. And in PNG, we don't have a literary culture at all. It was there sort of a few years after independence, but it's sort of just waned off. And there's been a big push throughout the years, especially through Australian funding, to get that sort of kick-started again. And the response we always get is that Australia has to work, in a respectful relationship with the PNG government and its priorities. as you probably all know, PNG in Australia are focused on rugby league in PNG. There's no such thing as writers or literature in the country. So, So, through your writing, how do you see, or how has sort of the donor funding impacted, and has it been very effective, and how do donors work with Indian women writers to get their voices heard through literature?
Right. So I actually have no experience of donor funding, except it's not really quite donor funding. I did get one Chevening scholarship. So the Indian publishing and literary industry is very vibrant, but there is a bias, and certainly this is what we call the colonial tilt. English language reading is much smaller, but it is relatively speaking more powerful in terms of setting the public discourse. And even within India, the books that are published sell a little bit, but not very much. So what happens is that we're often westward looking. The most powerful Indian writers tend to be the ones that are published in the West, which would be the UK and the US. The UK particularly, but also the US increasingly. And what happens is that a lot of them are actually diaspora writers, so they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily writing that's coming out of India now. It describes the diaspora experience, for instance. It doesn't really describe the Indian experience of people living in India. And even when that does happen, that people living in India get published in the West, that seems to be the only way to sort of be heard outside the country and within the country. The problem is not so much outside the country. I think the problem is the within country, because within India we certainly should have the resources and the reach, really, to reach everyone in the country. We don't. Our distribution channels are not very well developed, but also that we do not have a single grant-making body in India, except the Sahitya Academy, which offers very small, very, very small grants, really nowhere near close to enough to cover the writing of a book or original social science kind of research or good translations. So the role of I mean, the donor, we don't have donor agencies as such. Certain individuals in their own individual capacities apply to universities abroad and get funding in whatever fashion they get, is my understanding. Perhaps Salil can correct me if I'm wrong.
There are a couple of foundations, but those are also highly competitive and
have just been set up in the
very
last
recently,
2 or 3 years.
and
Yes.
even the sums are simply not large enough for you to do a major piece of research.
Look, I have a little bit of experience in this. We'll talk about it after this session, so it might help. I actually think we've come to the end of our time, and I'm really sorry if there are more questions. Perhaps you'd like to speak to Salil and Annie afterwards. And thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk today, and for being a great audience. Thank you.